The laughter wasn't cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was polite. It was refined. It was the kind of soft, restrained amusement that lived in expensive concert halls and behind gloved hands. It's the kind that didn't shout its judgment, but whispered it in velvet tones. The kind that made a man feel smaller without ever raising its voice. Dean Martin stood just beyond the glow of the stage lights. One hand resting loosely around a glass of water, the other tucked into his jacket pocket. Listening as the last echoes of the evening's grand performance faded into applause. The hall was magnificent, tarched ceilings painted with fading angels. Balconies carved like lace, chandeliers dripping light like frozen rain. This was a cathedral for voices trained from childhood. For singers who had spent decades bending breath into perfection, Dean did not belong here. At least, not according to them. He had been invited as a guest, celebrity, a popular entertainer, a crooner, a man with charm, not discipline, style, not structure, feeling, not form, and everyone in that room knew the difference backstage. The world's most celebrated opera singer of the time, renowned, decorated, feared for his precision, was holding court. His voice had just conquered Verdi with surgical control, each note placed exactly where centuries of tradition demanded. Critics called him immaculate. Conductors called him untouchable. Students called him the standard. And tonight, he was calling Dean Martin. Interesting. Warm, the man said, swirling a crystal glass as several patrons leaned in. Pleasant? Very pleasant. But opera? He smiled slightly, not unkindly. Opera is not about charm. It is about command. A few quiet chuckles. Another guest added, Dean Martin sings the way people smile in photographs. More laughter, gentle, polite, devastating. Dean stood close enough to hear it all. He didn't react at first. He simply looked down at the floor, at the way the polished marble reflected broken pieces of light. For a moment, he wasn't in a concert hall anymore. He was somewhere far smaller. A cramped childhood home. A radio playing late at night. A young boy listening through walls, copying melodies he didn't understand. Feeling something move inside his chest before he had language for it. He had never learned music the way they had. No conservatory. No lineage of maestros. No rigid vocal. Architecture, he had learned it the way lonely people often do. By listening, by trying, by failing, by feeling. The opera singer's voice drifted again. Mr. Martin has a wonderful career, truly. But classical singing is another world. It is built on rules, on breath discipline, on centuries of refinement. You cannot simply walk into it. This time, the laughter lingered longer. Dean slowly lifted his head. Across the room, the opera singer noticed him. Their eyes met. The conversation stalled. The famous man hesitated, then lifted his glass slightly, a courteous nod. Mr. Martin, he said, I hope you didn't take offense. I meant only that our crafts are different. A small one, controlled, the kind that never reveals what's happening underneath. Different, Dean repeated quietly. Yes, the man said. Opera is a science, a discipline. It requires a voice shaped for it. What kind of voice is that? Dean asked. The opera singer studied him, as if assessing an instrument. One trained to endure, to carry power without breaking. To stand in a hall like this with no microphone and command every corner of it? Dean nodded slowly. Around them, people sensed something shifting. Conversations thinned. Glasses stopped clinking. The air grew attentive. The opera singer smiled again, perhaps realizing the attention he now held. Forgive me, he said lightly. I did not mean to lecture. Dean's voice remained gentle. No, I'm listening. A pause. Then the opera singer did something that surprised even himself. If you like, he said, gesturing casually toward the distant stage. You're welcome to try. There's a piano still warm. I'd be curious to hear how your voice handles. Something structured. It was offered like a compliment. It landed like a challenge. The room stilled. No one spoke. The chandelier seemed suddenly louder than the people. Dean looked past the man, through the open doorway to where the grand piano sat beneath the fading lights. The stage where legends stood, where mistakes echoed longer than applause. He had spent his life in nightclubs, studios, sound stages, places where emotion mattered more than technique. This was different. This was their world, and they were watching to see him fail inside it. Dean exhaled. He could decline, smile, make a joke, keep his reputation safe. Instead, he nodded. "All right," he'd said. A soft ripple moved through the room. The opera singer raised his brows slightly, then gestured. "After you." Dean walked. Each step toward the stage felt longer than the last. He felt eyes tracking him, expectations sharpening, assumptions settling into place. He could almost hear the reviews being written in advance. Charming, but out of his depth. Warm, but untrained. A crooner playing dress-up in a cathedral. He climbed the steps. The piano bench creaked as he sat. The pianist, uncertain, looked at him. "What would you like, Mr. Martin?" Dean hesitated. He did not choose something easy, he chose something sacred. "Ave Maria," he said quietly. The whisper that followed was unmistakable surprise, concern, amusement. The pianist's hands hovered, then touched the keys. The first notes floated into the hall. And Dean Martin closed his eyes. Not to perform, but to remember. He remembered his father's tired voice after long shifts, his mother's quiet songs in the kitchen, late nights when music felt like a friend instead of a career. He remembered every room he had ever sung in where no one was listening, every note he had ever held simply because it meant something. When he opened his mouth, there was no showmanship. There was no smile. There was only breath and something else. Something deeper. The first note did not announce itself. It entered the room the way dawn enters, a dark street slowly, softly. Nstoppa Bly, and somewhere behind him, the opera singer's smile began to fade. Because this voice was not trying to impress. It was trying to speak, and the room was already starting to listen. The first note should have vanished. That was what the opera singer expected. In halls like this, weak voices dissolved. Thin voices scattered. Untrained voices exposed themselves immediately, stripped bare by space and silence. This room had humbled hundreds of talented performers over the decades. It had a way of returning sound to its sender and asking, "Is that all you are?" But Dean Martin's voice did not vanish. It stayed. It moved. It unfolded gently into the air, not pushed, not forced, but placed as if someone had opened a window inside the music and allowed something warm and human to step through. The sound drifted upward, touched the balcony's edge, and did not collapse. It did not scatter. It did not beg for help from the piano it held. A small disturbance rippled through the listeners at first. They told themselves it was novelty, acoustics, surprise, the charm of a familiar voice in an unfamiliar place. The opera singer folded his arms loosely, his posture relaxed, his expression still carrying that faint, courteous amusement. He had heard thousands of singers. He knew how this went. Early warmth, early promise, then the moment where the breath fails, where the tone thins, where the room exposes what training has not fortified. He waited for that moment. Dean reached the end of the first phrase and took another breath, and something changed, not in volume, in gravity. The second phrase did not float, it anchored. It carried a quiet weight, as though the sound had learned the shape of the room and decided to remain within it. The chandeliers did not glitter as brightly anymore. The murmurs at the back of the hall stopped completely. The pianist, without realizing it, softened his touch, following rather than guiding, his eyes lifting from the keys as if unsure when he had begun to listen instead of accompany. Dean did not open his eyes. He was not performing for them. He was somewhere else, inside the song. Memory had begun to speak. Each note was no longer a demonstration of sound, but a conversation with something unseen. His voice did not climb the melody the way trained voices often did, conquering it with precision. It walked through it, as one walks through a childhood home long after everyone has left, touching corners gently, aware that each step carries something old. The opera singer's smile faded entirely. He leaned forward a fraction, not in admiration. In assessment, he began listening, not for beauty, but for failure. He listened for the crack, for the strain, for the exposed seam where technique should have lived. But instead, he heard restraint. He heard breath that arrived exactly when it was needed. He heard phrasing that did not collapse into indulgence. Most unsettling of all, he heard control, not the rigid, visible kind drilled into conservatory students, but a quieter one, a kind built from years of standing before audiences and surviving not on perfection, but on presence. The voice did not fight the hall. It cooperated with it. The melody rose into a higher passage. Several guests shifted slightly. This was where it would happen. This was where warmth met architecture and lost. Dean's brow tightened subtly. His shoulders did not lift. His jaw did not force the note open. He adjusted something invisible. Breath changed, posture deepened. The note emerged, and the room did not reject it. It widened. The sound did not thin. It did not flatten. It did not retreat. It moved forward, carrying a fragile clarity. That felt less like projection and more like invitation. The opera singer straightened. A faint crease appeared between his brows. This was not supposed to be possible. Not like this. Not. Without years inside rehearsal rooms where mirrors watched every muscle and instructors reshaped every vowel. And yet, here was a man known for nightclubs and microphones, shaping a classical line with an instinct that did not ask permission. The pianist's hands slowed. The tempo softened. Without discussion, without signal, the accompaniment surrendered control. The hall was no longer hosting a challenge. It was witnessing something. Dean's voice reached the heart of the piece now, the part where the melody ceases to be beautiful and begins to be vulnerable, where the song stops asking to be admired and begins asking to be believed. His tone darkened slightly. It's not with sadness, but with honesty. The notes carried the texture of lived hours of disappointments, absorbed quietly, of joys never announced, only felt. It was the sound of someone who had spent years letting other people's emotions move through him, and had finally discovered what his own sounded like. The opera singer no longer listened for errors. He listened for explanation and found none. What he heard did not obey the rules he had built his life upon. It did not prioritize force. It did not pursue spectacle. It did not treat the hall as something to be conquered. It spoke to it, and the hall responded. The air felt heavier now, as if every breath had weight. People had stopped leaning, stopped shifting. Even blinking felt intrusive. A woman near the aisle slowly lowered her glass without realizing it. Somewhere in the balcony, a man who had attended performances here for 40 years found his throat tightening over a song he had heard. Hundreds of times Dean moved into the final passages. This was where opera demanded certainty, where voices were expected to stand unyielding, declaring their right to be heard. Dean did not declare. He entrusted. The last phrases were not larger. They were closer. Each note carried the suggestion of a hand reaching rather than a banner rising. The sound did not dominate the room. It drew it inward, as though the space itself were leaning to listen more carefully. The opera singer felt something unfamiliar. Brush his awareness. Not admiration, disorientation. His entire career had been built on measurable things: technique, range, discipline, reputation, the visible architecture of mastery. But what stood before him now did not fit the architecture. It was built of something less precise and far more difficult to acquire: meaning Dean approached the final note. The pianist did not resolve the chord. He waited. Dean did not close the sound. He released it. The note lingered, not as volume, but as presence, and then receded slowly into silence, not cut, not ended, but allowed to disappear on its own terms? No, one applauded. They couldn't. The silence was not empty. It was full, the kind that presses gently against the chest, the kind that makes people aware of their breathing, the kind that refuses to be interrupted because it is still saying something. Dean's eyes opened. He did not look toward the opera singer. He looked into the room, and for the first time since he had entered it, no one in that hall was measuring him. They were feeling behind him. The opera singer remained standing, his arms no longer folded, his glass untouched. For a long moment he did not move. Then very slowly, he exhaled, not in disbelief, in recognition. Because whatever he had expected to hear, it had not been this, and whatever he thought defined mastery, it was beginning to shift. The silence did not break. It stood. It occupied the hall the way a living thing might, suspended between the last note and whatever came after it. The chandeliers continued to glow. The stage lights remained fixed. The piano lid reflected Dean Martin's still figure like a dark mirror, and yet something in the room had changed its posture, as though the space itself were reconsidering what it believed. Dean remained seated. He did not bow. He did not smile. He simply rested his hands lightly on his knees, breathing slowly, allowing the quiet to exist without trying to manage it. He had learned long ago that the most powerful moments in music were not made by sound, but by what sound left behind. Somewhere in the audience, a man shifted, then froze, unsure if movement was permitted. The opera singer took a step forward. The soft sound of his shoes on the floor seemed impossibly loud. He crossed the small distance between himself and the edge of the stage, stopping just below it, close enough now to see the faint tension along Dean's jaw, the controlled stillness of a man who had given something personal without. Announcing that he had done so, the famous singer did not speak immediately. He looked up at Dean, as one might look at a structure one believed he understood and had just discovered was built on different principles. When he finally spoke, his voice was not raised. It did not carry. The hall leaned in anyway, where he asked quietly, "Did you learn to do that?" The question rippled. It was not what anyone expected. They had expected commentary, praise, technical critique, a polite compliment wrapped in authority. They had expected him to explain what had just happened. Instead, he had asked how it had become possible. Dean considered him. For a moment, the answer he might have given, the one people assumed he would give, floated nearby. Clubs, studios, experience, talent. He let it pass. "I didn't," Dean said. The opera singer frowned slightly. "You didn't learn?" Dean shook his head. "Not the way you mean." Stood now, slowly, the bench creaking as he did. From this angle, under these lights, the distinction between the two men became sharper. One carried the visible marks of disciplined posture, refined by repetition, breath shaped by doctrine, a body trained to obey sound. The other carried something less immediately readable, ease that came from years of public vulnerability, stillness that came from surviving rooms that did not forgive mistakes. "I listened," Dean said. "For a long time." The opera singer waited. "Two people," Dean continued. "Two rooms. To what made them quiet. To what made them restless. To what made them stay. And when I sang, I tried to give back what I heard." The opera singer's gaze did not leave him. "That does not explain how you sustained those lines," he said. "How you shaped the phrases. How you carried the hall without force." Dean's mouth curved slightly. "Not a smile, maybe," he said. "It explains why." A murmur stirred, then disappeared again. The opera singer turned slightly, glancing out at the audience, then back at Dean. There was something unsettled now in his expression. Not threatened, challenged. "Double quotes for decades," he said slowly. "I have trained voices. Brilliant ones. beautiful ones. And most of them fail not because they lack range, but because they cannot enter a song without standing between it and the listener. His eyes lifted briefly to the ceiling, then returned. "You did not stand between anything," he said. "You stepped aside." The words seemed to surprise him as he spoke them. He paused, then, unexpectedly, he extended a hand, not upward, sideways. "Double quotes, would you?" he said. "Sing again." A breath moved through the hall. "Not to demonstrate," he added. "With me." The invitation did not sound ceremonial. It sounded uncertain. Dean looked at the hand, then at the man, then back toward the piano. The pianist had not moved. His hands rested near the keys, his body poised not as an accompanist, but as a witness. "What?" someone whispered. The opera singer's voice softened. "Choose anything," he said. "Not to impress. Not to prove. To speak." Dean hesitated. This was not part of anything he had expected a moment ago. He had been the subject of quiet judgment now. He was being asked to share a space long guarded by hierarchy. "Very well," he said. He turned back to the piano, but did not sit. Instead, he remained standing. The opera singer stepped onto the stage. The audience's breath tightened. Two worlds that had never needed each other now occupied the same light. Dean glanced at the pianist. "Something simple," he said. "Whatever you feel." Pianist nodded once and let his hands find a soft progression. The opera singer closed his eyes, not in preparation, in listening. Dean began, not with melody, with a single line, unadorned, low. Sound entered the hall like a thought. The opera singer waited, then, gently. He joined, not above, beside. His voice was unmistakable, rich, disciplined, resonant with years of study. But now, instead of leading, it curved toward Dean's, shaping itself around the quieter tone. Discovering space where he had always built structure, their voices did not compete. They explored. The opera singer adjusted his volume unconsciously, finding himself reducing rather than expanding, listening not for where to assert, but where to leave room. Dean, hearing this, allowed his own sound to rise slightly, not in power, but in presence. 2 methods of a lifetime. 2 definitions of mastery. Finding a third between them. The harmony was not perfect. It was better. It was alive. There were moments where the opera singer's voice threatened to overtake and he pulled back, moments where Dean's tone drifted fragile, and the other steadied it without consuming it. The hall had never heard self-sound like this. This was not tradition. This was not innovation. This was conversation. As they reached the center of the piece, something in the opera singer's face shifted. The discipline remained. The authority remained. But behind it, something softened. The guarded distance he had carried all evening thinned, replaced by a focus that was no longer evaluative, but engaged. He was not standing beside a crooner. He was standing inside a moment he could not reproduce. When the final harmony faded, it did not dissolve into silence. It released it. And for the second time that night, the room could not respond. But this time, the silence did not belong to Dean Martin. It belonged to both of them. The opera singer opened his eyes, and in them was something that no review had ever written about him. Wonder. For several seconds after the final harmony vanished, no one in the hall seemed to remember how applause began. Hands rested in laps. Fingers curled around the edges of seats. Breathing was audible in places where sound had never mattered before. The piano lid reflected 2 men standing under lights meant for a different kind of certainty, their shadows stretching behind them like long questions. The opera singer did not step back. He did not bow. Instead, he remained where he was, facing the audience, his expression unreadable, as though he were listening for something that had not yet finished speaking. When he finally turned, it was not toward Dean, it was toward the hall. "I have sung here," he said quietly, For many years, his voice carried easily, but it no longer sought the farthest wall. It stayed close. It asked rather than announced. I have stood on this stage when people came expecting perfection. They came to hear how accurately a human being could repeat what history had written. A few heads inclined. Tonight, he continued, many of you came to witness a contrast. Subtle ripple passed through the seats. You came to hear what happens when one world meets another. When discipline meets familiarity. When tradition measures itself against popularity. He paused. Some of you came expecting an answer. Slowly, toward Dean Martin. And some of you, he said, came expecting a failure. The word did not accuse. It illuminated. He took a breath. Deeper than one taken for projection, I believed, he went on. That a voice is defined by what it can withstand. By the range it can hold. By the halls it can command. His gaze lifted briefly, as if acknowledging the architecture itself. I have built my life on that belief. Then he looked back at Dean. And tonight, I was reminded that there is another definition. Dean stood with his hands loosely at his sides. He did not interrupt. He did not demur. He listened with the same attention he had given the music. The opera singer gestured, not theatrically, but openly. A voice, he said, is also defined by what it carries. The hall did not move. What it remembers, he added. What it allows others to recognize inside themselves. His throat tightened slightly. He did not conceal it. For the first time in many years, he said, I stood on this stage and realized I was no longer measuring sound. He let the words settle before finishing. I was measuring truth. Silence did not resist this time. It opened. Applause began hesitantly, as though the room were unsure whether such a thing belonged here. Then it grew, not in volume alone, but in depth. It did not roll like celebration. It rose like acknowledgement. People stood not because they were instructed to, but because sitting felt insufficient. The opera singer did not acknowledge the applause. Instead, he turned fully to Dean Martin, and something extraordinary happened. He bowed, not formally, not CEREMONIALOY. Simply a gesture stripped of theater, one human being to another. Dean's first reaction was not pride, it was discomfort. He stepped forward instinctively, his hands lifting slightly as if to ask the man to rise. Please, he said quietly. There's no, the opera singer straightened. There is, he replied, and in his eyes was no rivalry, only gratitude. You reminded me, he said, why I began. Dean studied him. Before halls, the man continued. Before reviews, before authority, there was a boy who heard a voice and felt less alone. He nodded once. Tonight, that boy listened again. They stood like that for a moment. Two careers intersecting not as hierarchies, but as histories. The applause continued, but it no longer framed the moment, it followed it. Backstage later, long after the crowd had thinned and the chandeliers dimmed, the opera singer sat alone in his dressing room. His costume hung untouched. His awards gleamed along the walls like a different life. He did not look at them. He held instead the folded program from the evening's performance. Dean Martin's name printed smaller than his own. He turned it over in his hands. On the back, in the empty white space, he wrote a single line. A voice is not what conquers a room. It is what allows a room to recognize itself. Years later, when students would ask him what had most shaped his teaching, he did not speak of instructors or institutions. He spoke of a night, when a man without their rules stepped into their world and did not try to own it. He spoke of a voice that did not arrive to impress, but to offer. And Dean Martin, when asked about the evening, never described it as a challenge one. He described it as a conversation he was allowed to have, because the truth both men carried away was the same. That mastery is not the loudest sound in the room, it is the one that leaves the deepest echo.